Hey guys, welcome back. In this video, we're going to move from colonial theory into post-colonial theory. So, the colonial period really ends. Europe's colonies really kind of almost all gain independence in the 20th century. We were talking about Frantz Fanon in the last video, and the fact that he was fighting for Algerian independence. Algeria gets its independence in 1962. So it's really in the period after that, so think 1970s, 1980s, that post-colonial theory becomes something that theorists are giving attention to, and they're giving attention for this reason. I alluded to this in a previous video. In a colonial relationship, there's obvious inequality. In a post-colonial relationship, there shouldn't be anymore, because the two countries are on equal footing, at least politically. But the reality is there is a gap between political equality and economic equality. There's a gap between political equality and cultural equality as well. And so post-colonial theory is interested in this idea. Okay, these colonies are no longer colonies. They're their own places now. Why is it that the former colonial powers still have so much power over them? And so this theory was created to explain that. It basically focuses on the cultural forces that enable post-colonial power. So that's it. It's going to be rooted in culture. In our textbook, there are 5 tenets of post-colonial theory. I'm going to cut you down to 3. Post-colonial theory emphasizes how the colonial past influences contemporary social life. Basically, the idea is, okay, so Algeria wins independence in 1962. It doesn't mean that everybody then in France suddenly is like, oh, all those Algerian people that we used to think were beneath us, turns out they're equal. We still have remnants of ideas about race and ethnicity. I mean, look at America. We're still dealing with we abolished slavery 150 years ago, and we still have racial issues. So post-colonial theory, that's like a basic tenet. Things didn't, just because you've got political changes doesn't mean you have cultural or economic changes. Second, and this is where it starts to get a little bit more interesting, I think. Post-colonial theory analyzes how culture and knowledge constructed by the colonizers affect the people living in the colonial world. So that idea of knowledge construction should remind you a little bit of the whole idea of race as a social construction. When we think about race as a social construction, what we're saying is people have created a class of thing called race. That's knowledge, right? All of a sudden, I didn't know there was this thing called white people, and then it turns out there is this thing called white people. That's a social construction, but it's where it's constructed is in the realm of knowledge. Okay, so the idea that culture and knowledge constructed by the colonizers continues to affect the people living in those places. That's the second tenet. The third tenet is going to be the reverse of that. Westerners, or the colonizers, and they were mostly European, their ideas about themselves are shaped through colonialism. The modern, we should think about ourselves as included in this. The modern West, so think Europe and America, and think Canada too, although I'm not sure they really do a whole lot wrong, created our image of ourselves through thinking about colonized people. Okay, so those are the 3. First of all, the idea that culture and knowledge doesn't just change when political changes. There are still remnants of those ideas. Second of all, the knowledge constructed by the colonizers affects the people who are living in the former colonies. And third, the colonizers' ideas about themselves are affected by their experience as colonizers, as colonial powers. Okay. Yeah, that's it. So now we move on to are a guy that you probably need to know his name. I try not to give names when they aren't totally necessary, but Edward Said, Said. It's not pronounced said, it's pronounced Said. He was Palestinian, I believe. Edward Said wrote a book in 1978 called Orientalism. And so the idea of Orientalism is that Western powers who had colonized had created this thing called the Orient. People in Asia didn't think about themselves as part of the Orient. They thought about themselves as Chinese or Japanese or Indian or whatever. They thought about themselves in terms of who they felt connected with. Westerners came about and said, well, there's this thing called the Orient, and it's all those people that we took over and dominate now. And based on that, we also can know something about us because we're different than that. And so that's the basic idea of Orientalism. It follows this postcolonial theory. It's sort of maybe the first case of postcolonial theory was Edward Said's book, Orientalism. The key term for this is discourse. He's not the first guy who came up with the theory of discourse. I believe Michel Foucault, a French theorist, was the first person who really, or at least he's the one who's most famous for talking about discourse. But Edward Said applies it to this idea of postcolonial theory. Discourse, so first of all, your common sense understanding of discourse as people talking or writing about something is right. The definition I'm going to give you is going to make it slightly more formal than that. It is a symbolic system that organizes and classifies the world. So a symbolic system, that basically means we create things and then define them. Race is a symbol. The Orient is a symbol. Whiteness is a symbol. A symbolic system just means a whole bunch of those things. So whiteness and race, whiteness and blackness, and Asianness or Orientalness, and the whole idea of the Orient and the whole idea of the West. I'm talking about all these things. This is a discourse. This is where Said is cool, though. He says that this symbolic system, this discourse, organizes and classifies the world. It teaches us how to understand things. That is cool. Because if you think about it, we have these understandings about, like when I said the Orient, you probably had some idea about it, even though there isn't a thing called the Orient. It's something people imagined into existence. But your understanding of existence has that symbol, the Orient, as part of it. And I guess that's it. But that's super cool. And it's also terrifying because who was it that taught you about that there was a thing called the Orient? Who was it that taught you there was a thing called blackness? Who was it that taught you there was a thing called race at all? We just take these things for granted. But they all were things that were imagined into existence, and people talked about them and wove them together into a symbolic system. And now you and I live our lives as though they're real, and they're not, which is terrifying. But cool for Edward Said to be the guy who kind of puts this together with regard to a post-colonial and, by implication, a racial world. Okay. And here's the other thing about discourses, just to add one more layer of coolness to it. So I gave you a definition. It's a symbolic system that organizes and classifies the world. It produces understanding, which I've just made a big deal about how cool that is. Third, the extra layer of cool, discourses are a form of power because they teach people how to understand something. So a racist person engaging in a racist discourse is exerting power. They are explaining the world in a way that is going to have real world consequences for people who are racial minorities. So that idea of discourses being a form of power is a really important idea. So let's talk about Orientalist discourse, because that's what Edward Said, that was the book that he wrote. He said, first of all, Orientalist discourse creates a thing called the Orient. So we talked about that. It organizes and classifies the world. There isn't a thing called the Orient, but this discourse says all of those people in Asia, we can think about them as one thing. They're not one thing, but we can think about them that way because now we've got this term called the Orient. It takes a wide variety of distinct, unique regions and cultures and boom, puts them into one thing, which, if you're thinking about America in this case, you're probably thinking about American Indians, exact same thing, right? Native Americans, American Indians, they're a great diverse set of societies, and we lump them all together. That's not an Orientalist discourse, but like I guess a Native American discourse or an American Indian discourse or something like that, a colonial discourse. And now this category exists and people can understand the world in terms of it. The next thing Orientalist discourse does is it defines, so it starts pouring ideas into that category. It defines the Orient as essentially different from the West. Otherwise, we wouldn't need a category, right? We would just be all people. But as soon as you say, well, that's different than this, then you're creating differences among people. And then the third step is not going to be surprising. The West is defined in opposition to the Orient and in a superior way. So the West is rational and active. And what else is the West, according to Said? Hold on, let me pull it on my screen. And morally upright. Those are all positive things, right? The Orient is defined in opposition to that. So they are irrational. They have all those folk beliefs and these religions that I don't believe in, and so obviously that's not rational. They're passive, obviously, because we colonized them, and like now we had power over them. So obviously they're, not as active as we are. And they're morally backward because have you ever seen the things they do? That's the idea of Orientalism. In our case, with Native Americans, there is a degree of positivity because there's also this essentialist link to closeness to nature. But it's important to just understand that there still is this essential difference. White people are this way and Native American people are that way. And yeah, nature's great and all, but we are the more sophisticated, civilized, forward-thinking. So the discourse ends up being disempowering in that situation as well. All right. That's it. Postcolonial. I mean, that's kind of long. I really didn't have that many points, but it kind of went long. But that's all right. Postcolonial discourse creates a thing, defines that thing as essentially different, and then defines us as superior. And that's the way it goes. All right. We've moved from the invention of race through colonial theory, through post-colonial theory. In the next one, we're going to get a little bit more specific into America. We're going to deal with critical race theory. So I'm recording this in April of 2021. I just don't know when people are going to be watching this. Critical race theory has gone through a very public, not complete disapproval, but a disapproval from a lot of people in power, saying critical race theory is a major problem. It keeps people apart. It is creating racial antagonism. So we're going to deal with critical race theory in the next video to talk about what it is, why it exists, and why you probably don't need to be scared about it if you're a sociology major, because it's basically sociology with an eye to race. So I'll talk to you about that in the next video.